You can hear me? If not, can you hear me? Yes, I'm getting some thumbs up here. Great, thank you. So good evening and good afternoon. Welcome to our last session for the first day of our research conference. My name is Domenico Tabasso. I'm a senior economist at the Joint Data Center, and it is my great pleasure to moderate this session, which we have structured as a panel. As we have heard this morning or this afternoon for some of us from the head of the Joint Data Center, Bjorn Gilsetter, one of the objectives of the center is to facilitate the exchange of knowledge between researchers and practitioners, but even more, to even facilitate the translation of research inputs and concepts into policy indications, into elements that can effectively inform the work of practitioners and policymakers. So we are very fortunate this evening to be joined by a group of distinguished guests who will help us explore this link between research and policymaking and policy-related work more in general. And we will try with this panel to some extent to answer some of the questions that we heard coming during the opening remarks that we had at the beginning of the conference. I will introduce the panelists in just a few seconds, but first allow me to go through some basic housekeeping rules. This session is recorded, like any session of this conference, and for this particular session, translation is available. So if you'd like to hear this session in either French or Spanish, please click on the little globe on the left-hand side of your screen. Spoiler alert, one of our distinguished guests will be speaking in French, so you're welcome to use translation to listen to his intervention in either English or Spanish, should you wish so. You are welcome, of course, to ask questions using our chat throughout the panel, or toward the end of the panel, if you'd like to come in, raise your hand, and if time permits, we'll be very happy to give you the floor. Regarding the questions, I would also like to remind those of you who are listening to us through YouTube that you're more than welcome to write your questions in the YouTube chat. Our colleagues are monitoring their chat and will report it to the panelists. Fine. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We will hear today from Blaise Bienvenue, who is the Director General of the Institute of Statistics, Economics, and Social Studies of the Central African Republic. Mr. Ali, welcome to our panel. We have Carolina Sánchez-Páramo. Hello. We have Carolina Sánchez-Páramo. Bonjour, monsieur. Carolina Sánchez-Páramo is the Global Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank. Carolina, I can see your screen. Welcome to our panel too. And we have Ninette Kelley, who is a former senior officer of UNHCR. She was, for example, UNHCR representative in Lebanon, and is the author of People Forced to Flee, History, Change and Challenge, which is a UNHCR flagship report, which I understand is due to be made public available in February. I'm also very pleased to inform you that we will have other guests throughout the session. We will listen to them both throughout the session and toward the end of it. But let's dive into this panel, which is, as I said before, the aim of it is really to take a closer look to the link, which sometimes is a bit obscure for some of us, between research and policy and programming. We'd like to do this from two angles, if you want. We'd like to hear about what research can offer to policy and programming, but we'd also like to ask ourselves what type of indications researchers can extract from operation, policies, and programming. So what can they get in terms of ideas, in terms of areas of investigation, in terms of data, in terms of new opportunities for new and innovative studies? So in opening this panel, I would also like to remind all of you that you are more than welcome to fill our survey so that you yourself, all of you participants to this conference, can give, leave your opinion in relation to your views about policy, the relation between research and policy making. So it's now time to open our panel, and I'm very pleased to do that by posing my first question, which I will pose to Mr. Ali, the Director General of the Institute of Statistics of Central Africa. Mr. Ali, we are delighted that you were able to accept our invitation. I will speak in English to simplify the work of our interpreters. Of course, you are more than welcome to answer in French. So you are joining us from Bangui. We know that the bank and the Joint Data Center and UNHCR are working with the Statistical Institute toward the inclusion of those forcibly displaced in the statistical system, in the statistical surveys and analysis. So we're very pleased to be able to talk to you today. Now, for them, I will move now to ask you the first question, which is based exactly on the fact that there are many internally displaced people in the Central African Republic, more than 700,000 according to the last figures that I've seen from UNHCR and IDMC. We imagine this can pose a serious problem to data collection and analysis. So we'd like to know in which way research, whether it's statistical research, economic research, can influence your work and that of the Institute in relation to forced displacement, in relation specifically to the inclusion of those forcibly displaced in national statistics. To what extent can you rely on research to inform your work, or also what areas would you like to research to focus on to help your activities, both yours personally and those of the Institute you lead? The floor is yours, Monsieur. Over to you.
Oui, bonsoir à tout le monde. Bonsoir à tous les panélistes. Je suis effectivement Monsieur Bienvenue Ali. Je suis le directeur général de l'ICASES de la République centrafricaine. Vous savez que la République centrafricaine, c'est un pays au cœur du continent qui a une population estimée à environ 5 600 000 habitants en 2022. Et effectivement, le pays fait face depuis un certain nombre d'années à des problèmes de conflits qui occasionnent naturellement les déplacements de population. Et comme vous venez de l'expliquer dans votre introduction, on estime à environ 700 000 le nombre de personnes déplacées dans le pays. Et donc, à cet effet, nous, statisticiens qui réalisons les études sur le terrain, sommes souvent confrontés à cette situation, dans la mesure où, quand vous prenez les populations déplacées, il y a une partie qui vit dans les familles d'accueil et une partie qui vit dans les sites de déplacés. Nos statistiques ici estiment le nombre de populations qui vivent déplacées, qui vivent dans les familles d'accueil à environ 70% des déplacés, et c'est seulement les 30% qui vivent dans les sites d'accueil. Donc, pour nous, la recherche devrait beaucoup plus contribuer à nous appuyer dans la méthodologie d'approche des personnes déplacées. Comment faire pour collecter les données auprès de ces populations déplacées, dans la mesure où certains sont dans les familles d'accueil, certains sont sur les sites des déplacés, et l'accès même dans certaines zones sont difficiles chez nous à cause de l'insécurité. Et donc, nous pensons que la recherche va beaucoup plus nous appuyer dans ce sens pour disposer des méthodologies raffinées de collecte des données et d'analyse des données auprès des personnes déplacées. Nous savons tout souvent que les personnes déplacées qui vivent dans les familles d'accueil constituent une charge pour les familles d'accueil. Et la recherche, justement, peut contribuer à nous informer davantage sur la situation des personnes déplacées internes dans les familles d'accueil, sur la situation des ménages qui les accueillent. Est-ce que ces personnes déplacées vont contribuer à appauvrir davantage ces familles et autant de préoccupations que la recherche peut aider justement l'Institut national de la statistique à élucider cela en dehors de la méthodologie, comme je venais de l'expliquer. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. Thank you so much. You've already posed and highlighted a number of items which I'm sure we are going to discuss throughout this panel. So I'm sure we'll be able to come back to some of these elements that you have highlighted so clearly. So thank you. Ninette, let me come to you because you also had, as I said at the beginning, you know, a direct contact with very difficult situation. You've been the UNHCR representative in Lebanon. So apart from several other, of course, roles that you have occupied within UNHCR. Can you tell us in which way as research, have you seen research influencing your work? To which extent you've seen the work, research influencing your work, or that of the offices you've led, or even more, you know, related to UNHCR in general? You have a broad experience in UNHCR, so we'd be happy to hear your reflections on this. The floor is yours, Ninette.
Thank you so much, Domenico. And thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, because it's been so enlightening for me and such a great opportunity to read so many interesting research papers that really are of import to the work that we do in UNHCR generally, but also to the contexts that are under study. And if I just look at the last two assignments, Lebanon and New York, they're very different operational environments, and perhaps I could shed a little light on how research did or did not affect the policy options of government in Lebanon and our own operations, and also the work in New York. There are two ways that research can really influence field operations. One is by providing a knowledge base to influence government policy. And the other is to provide a base for which we can assess our own operational interventions and adjust them so that they have the greatest impact. If I look at the first element in terms of trying to influence government policy in Lebanon, we had so many areas that we were engaged with government, from very basic ones like the need to register refugees. There was at a certain point of time an interest in the government in us not registering. And it was important for us to be able to show to them the importance of registration, not just in terms of identifying the numbers of refugees crossing, where they were living, what their needs were, but that could also over time provide the anonymized data that would be very useful to government ministries. And that was a persuasive task that more research, I think, could have benefited us at that time. There also was an issue of statelessness. Statelessness has been for many years a real problem in Lebanon, and it has the reason why it is not resolved really is at its root a political problem. But I am not aware of there being any study that has looked at the socioeconomic cost to Lebanon of an ongoing and increasing stateless population. I think that could be very useful to a policy discussion with government. At the time that I was in Lebanon, between 2010 and 2015, we were also trying to regularize the stay of refugees and provide advocate for work permits for refugees, especially in areas that could be of benefit to the Lebanese economy. Had we had more detailed economic studies on where those areas might be and what the costs and benefits of such a policy would be for the government, I think it could have aided our policy and advanced our policy discussions. We did engage in good assessments with respect to the impact of cash assistance, because if you can believe it, there was a big debate at the time as to whether or not in-kind or cash was better. And UNHCR and ICRC took a look at the effect of the impact of cash assistance on winterization, which I think was also helpful in the policy discussions at that time. the World Bank did a very seminal study on the impact of the Syria crisis on the economy of Lebanon, which I think was also critical because it helped to advance development funding for Lebanon in important ways, but also set in train research that has underpinned the financing envelopes that the World Bank developed post-2016. But it also brought into better relief both the cost and potential benefits of the refugees inside Lebanon and the humanitarian efforts that were underway and the investments that were being made in Lebanon at that time. And I think another area where we could have benefited, I was so happy to see the paper in this conference on what are the relevance of push and pull factors in terms of return. There was a sense in Lebanon, I can't say it was a prevailing sense, but it was an important one, that suggested that if the refugees' lives were made more miserable within Lebanon, that would promote return to Syria. Whereas we were trying to say, no, it's really issues of security and stability and ability to get on with life that will be the most determinative. But having a study in our back pocket to deepen our own understanding and advance our advocacy, I think is an example of something that could be most helpful. On the operational side, in terms of operational implementation, we were quite lucky because we were a rapidly growing operation. I say lucky, luck built on a terrible, tragic circumstance, but we did get a lot of money and we had the benefit of experts from around the world coming on emergency deployments, and they brought the best knowledge available in terms of how to do shelter, food, cash assistance, and we really benefited from that, and we benefited from their updated knowledge. Whether that is true on less well-financed, less resource operations, I highly doubt it, which brings to a point of perhaps for further discussion is how we can disseminate research in a way that is more readily accessible to operations in the field. I don't want to go on too long. I'll mention New York. New York is a completely different experience altogether. In New York headquarters, my responsibilities were really on issues related to forced displacement, so they're not at all reflective, I think, of what happens at New York generally. But in terms of the forced displacement file, when I was there with Bjorn, and I'd be interested to know whether he might agree or not, but the issues primarily were on conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution, for which the analysis and the research was primarily of a political dimension. I did not see a lot of room for socioeconomic analysis in that kind of discussion, and I think it would benefit from a lot more research in that regard. There was a focus on financing. Again, that was focused most on what were the needs, the humanitarian or development needs. But in my view, it could have benefited from much more research and analysis on the impact of more humanitarian funding and better ways of delivering humanitarian and development assistance. And there was a lot of emphasis on UN coordination. I'd have to say one of the most I thought, impressive exercises in terms of research and application to field realities was the development of statistical standards on IDP and refugees that was done in a multifunctional way by the expert group and endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission, which I think has been a great leap forward, provided that these standards are fully implemented in the field. So I think I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Ninette. That was extremely insightful, and thank you for offering both the Lebanon and the New York view, which are, of course, different point of views, different angles. So that was very enriching. Thank you very much, Ninette. And again, there are several elements on which we can come back later. But there is actually one element that I would like already to start highlighting in my next question that I would like to pose to Carolina, because if I understood correctly, Ninette, you mentioned using, especially in relation to the intervention of the bank in Lebanon, using research to underpin interventions. And I believe that's something that Carolina might see almost every day in your role as the director of the global inequity practice. You really are, from my point of view, at the intersection between policy and research, between policy and analysis. So I'd like to ask you basically two things. One is how does research inspire your work, but also whether you can guide us a bit in the way you and your team translate research into policy intervention. This translation process, if you want. Carolina, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Domenico, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, not just as a member of this panel, but I'm also delighted that the center has organized this second conference. I was lucky enough to be there for the first one in person in that case, and I thought it was an incredible experience. So I'm really, really glad that despite the challenges that the virtual world presents, you have gone ahead and organized this second one. So at the World Bank, like I think Ninette pointed out for UNHCR, research is really critical to our work and our mission. So let me talk a little bit about that, and as well as specifically for the team that I manage, the Poverty and Equity team. So even though most of the World Bank resources are actually dedicated to supporting investments in client countries, the World Bank frequently refers to itself as a knowledge bank, right? And that's how we speak about the institution. And I think we consider ourselves a knowledge bank. It's not just lip service. And that's important already, right? That it's a sort of description that doesn't necessarily capture how we allocate resources, but it certainly captures what we think is the essence of how we work. So what does that really mean? It means two things. One is that data and analysis are critical when it comes to informing the work that we do with our clients. And by that work, I mean advisory work, but I also mean work at the policy and program levels. So we very much believe, and I think this is also something that Ninette alluded to, on work that is informed by evidence, right? And that responds to the questions and challenges that evidence surfaces. But we also support governments and try to sort of help them in conducting evidence-based policymaking themselves, right? So I think those are the two elements in which research and knowledge come into play importantly in our work. And when you talk to governments and partners, they actually frequently mention these elements as part of the value addition of the bank, right? The fact that we are able to marry knowledge and operations in that way, and that they consider that a very powerful mix that they appreciate. In the Poverty and Equity team, we really take this at heart, and research and knowledge and data are fundamental to who we are and what we do. And the reason for this is because we believe that it is very difficult to tackle problems that are invisible. So, we do put a lot of effort in getting the right data. And I think that's particularly pertinent, on the topic that this conference is discussing, displacement, refugees. But it is also very difficult to define and implement effective solutions if you don't have a very good understanding of what the drivers and constraints are, to, in this case, or at least in our case, reducing poverty and inequality. And likewise, if you don't have a good understanding for the impact that different programs and policies may have on the population of interest. So for those two reasons, we devote a lot of our energy, effort, and time to really building that evidence base. In practice, I think about ourselves as sort of having three roles. We are, data, knowledge, and sort of research producers, consumers, and as you said, translators or connectors. So let me talk a little bit about what those three mean, because this happens all the time at the same time. We are knowledge producers in the sense that most of what we do is actually either filling data gaps or filling knowledge gaps on issues related to poverty and equity at the country, at the regional, and at the global level. An example of this, a very recent example, it's all the work that we have undertaken during the COVID-19 crisis, where statistical institutes were not able to produce, household surveys and other important data sources. We actually implemented a global effort using phone surveys to understand how the crisis was affecting households. And we are very proud that with the support from the center, we were able to include refugees and displaced populations in those efforts in several countries. And that data, that evidence was critical in informing how we supported governments as they thought about the right policies that were needed to deal with the crisis. And Ninette alluded to the work that we did in Lebanon a few years ago around the Syrian refugee crisis and how impactful that was also for the government. So that's, so we are producers, right? We do produce knowledge and we use it. But we are also consumers. And here is where I think academia and research plays a critical role, because we frequently rely on the work of others, and particularly the work on academics, on frontier issues, on new questions, on topics and challenges that are sometimes difficult for us to tackle. We look at them as the source of new data and new information, and we engage with them on a continuous basis. And I want to highlight this, that we are not passive consumers, we are active consumers. And I do want to sort of share that with this audience and sort of invite them to engage. We do this in a variety of ways. We frequently invite academics and researchers to participate in our seminar series, to participate in our brown bank lunches, and interact with our staff, and explain to us how the work that they are doing can actually be useful in the context of our work. We frequently bring them on board as advisors or reviewers of the work that we do, because we want to make sure that what we are doing is technically robust and meets that very high bar that I think in general, we apply to research in an academic setting. And we also have them as contributors to some of the work that we do. So when I say consumers, right, it really means a lot of things, and it means this very sort of interactive relationship. And then finally, as you said, we act as translators, because sometimes you do see sort of a gap, right, between what's frontier research, academic research, and what a policymaker needs in terms of, designing a policy or a program. And we try to bridge that gap and translate, right, translate this research into practical policy advice. And that could mean taking a theoretical idea that has been developed in an academic context and really thinking about what that means for policy. It could mean taking something that has been done for a country and exploring the possibility of replicating that analysis for another country or a number of countries, as well as, anything in between. So that's kind of one type of translation, right, from academia to policymakers. But I would like to think that we also translate the other way around, and we help surface, questions that policymakers may have, right, and some of our counterparts and partners, and we sort of bring those to the attention of academia in the hope that they would take those questions on and would help us answer them. And I hope that everybody participating in the conference today do keep their ears, sort of very attuned to what the needs of the world are in this sphere, because we really need their help in that context. So those are some of the things that we do, and very happy to touch upon those as we move forward in the conversation. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Carolina. I mean, clearly this first round of questions has already brought up so many interesting elements that we can further discuss later on in the panel. In the meantime, I see that there are some questions coming in. One element that I forgot to highlight: we're very happy for you to write questions in the chat. May I suggest that whenever you write a question, you specify whether you are asking the question to any specific panelist or whether the question is open to all the panelists. And of course, I invite all the panelists to start addressing the question in the chat if they want, or later on toward the end, we'll see if time permits, if we can read them aloud. Before we move on to the next round of questions for our panelists, I promised you I was going to bring in some more guests with us today, and it's time I would like to invite the first of these guests, and is Mr. Xavier de Victor, who I imagine many of you are familiar with. Xavier is joining us from DC. He's another World Bank officer, and it's a pleasure to have Xavier today with us, because Xavier, I would like to start with something about the past of Xavier, in the sense that Xavier has been really instrumental in leading the World Bank work engagement on forced displacement. And this morning, we heard Ms. Mary Pangestu mentioning the World Development Report, and mentioning the fact that the World Development Report in 2023 will be on forced displacement. And therefore, it's great to, for us that Xavier has been asked to co-direct this report. We have asked Xavier to come in and tell us something about the report, in particular in terms of how research will inform this report, and also how, the report itself will inform research. And so in terms of areas of research that we'll investigate, and other aspects related to this report. Xavier, if you are online, I can see you are among our participants now, so I would like to invite you to come in and tell us a bit more about this report. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Domenico. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for the invitation to this important event. And I'm very happy to be part of this conference. Like Carolina, I was there physically a couple of years ago, and like I guess all of us, I deeply regret that we have to do this by video this time. So thank you once again for giving us a quick opportunity to briefly mention this World Development Report, which, as you know, is an annual flagship analytical product of the bank. Our president, David Malpass, has actually decided that the next one, which will essentially come out in early 2023, so in a year, should be on cross-border mobility. And I just wanted, I thought it would be an important opportunity today to highlight the fact that this is really a very important signal of the interest that the World Bank is taking on issues of both forced displacement, but also economic migration. It also, I think, highlights the importance of research and of the work of many of the people around this virtual table, be it on data, be it on evidence building, or just be it on trying to reframe some of the normative assumptions and some of the frameworks that are typically being used to describe and discuss issues related to cross-border movement. And I think, Ninette earlier in the conversation made the point that evidence is absolutely critical when we talk to some of our client governments and try to make the case for this or that policy change. So I think in the case of the World Development Report, so it's obviously the work has just started, and therefore I'm not going to come up with a detailed description of the framework of what it does and so on. We will though have all the opportunities to engage, and we really look forward to engaging with many people around the table throughout the process. It's a one-year-long process that culminates in a discussion by our board of executive directors, where all member countries are being represented of the report. Now, maybe just a few points to provide some preview of some of the questions we are asking ourselves, and once again at the very beginning of the process. I guess, and maybe just to highlight just a few of them. One is really about this coverage of economic migrants and refugees. And I think everybody around the table probably recognizes that there is a fundamental and objective difference between the two groups of people. But I guess we also all recognize that there is a number of people who are basically somewhere in between. Not to say that the dichotomy does not have value, but to say that if this dichotomy may hide the existence of a group of people who've been characterized by Alex Pets as survivor migrants, who've been characterized by Alex Alenikov as fleers of necessity. So these people who basically are not strictly speaking refugees, but yet are moving in an environment of a constrained, agency-constrained set of choices, right? And I guess, one of the questions we'll be asking ourselves is, well, who exactly are these people? What can we say about them? How should we think about them? And how should we think about the extent of global responsibility sharing for some of these groups? And obviously, that's where the data become absolutely critical. If we want to go beyond, very simple advocacy, be it pro-migrants or anti-migrants, right? I think just trying to have a little bit of a sense of who are these people, how can they actually be described, how can they be characterized, how can they actually be established in some form of groupings, could be terribly important. Similarly, research on anything we know in terms of evidence about how to deal with these sort of groups, I think will be very helpful. I guess another point I wanted to make, and in a way in a very different perspective, which is that, as we all know, and especially on forced displacement, a number of issues have typically been framed in legal terms because of the history of the global response to forced displacement. And of course, this framing is terribly important, and there's no doubt in our mind on this. But I guess the question is, what can an economic perspective add to questions such as responsibility sharing, and how to make it actually effective and sustainable? What kind of an economic perspective, what can it bring to the question of rights and of protection and of the impact of having rights on economic development, on poverty reduction prospects, and the like? Which rights? So these are just some of the questions that I wanted to lay on the table. Obviously, a looming additional question will be around the issue of climate, and whether climate is likely to accelerate some of these movements or not, whether it will change the nature of some of these movements, and whether it will create a sense of enlarged collective responsibility or responsibility sharing for new groups of people. So I just maybe wanted to give these few thoughts just to hopefully trigger some reactions. By any means, please feel free to reach out if you have any evidence or data to share, and we very much look forward to engaging with this group when we have some ideas to test and to in order to benefit from your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Xavier. It's always great to hear from you. I should have actually mentioned in introducing that you, together with the colleagues at the bank and UNHCR, you were really behind the birth of the JDC itself. So to some extent, if we are here, is also thanks to your hard work and that of your colleagues. Thank you very much, Xavier. Of course, again, you also brought up several very interesting elements, and so I invite all the colleagues online to comment, to pose questions, and to use the chat to that effect. We've spoken a lot about policymakers. We've mentioned researchers, of course. We've mentioned the bank, UNHCR, but there are other stakeholders in the broad framework related to forced displacement. And an important stakeholder, an important group of stakeholders is that of the NGOs. So I'm very happy that is joining us today, Sarah Saka from the International Rescue Committee. Sarah, I would like to basically invite you to help us reflect with you on how the work of researchers can inform the work of NGOs, and also how NGOs themselves can propose themes and aspects for the investigation of researchers, or whether, for example, there is any element that you would like researchers to focus more on. So Sarah, please do come in, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Domenico, for the opportunity to speak, and thank you everyone else for your comments and for the research that has been presented. I will keep my remarks brief and hopefully address all three of those questions in these few minutes. So, echoing the panelists' comments about just how critical research is to inform, frame, and shape our policy advocacy and programming, from that of multilateral development banks to UN agencies to local international NGOs. And just as Carolina, I believe, was speaking to, we are continually trying to build our own evidence base as well, from our own local and national staff, for example, in Afghanistan, to inform our policy advocacy and our economic interventions and advocacy, all the way to outside researchers and coalitions we try to engage with. Of course, NGOs' roles are usually seen as frontline actors and implementers, but we're trying to also frame ourselves and see ourselves more as partners to practitioners, partners to advocates, partners to the communities we serve, and partners to researchers. And we also, in our advocacy, aim to translate our research in ways that can then be intelligible and used in dialogue with donors, governments, and other stakeholders. So getting a little bit more specific, a large part of our advocacy right now, as Xavier attested to, is calling for example, the need for more equitable, inclusive responsibility sharing, increased commitments and accountability in targets that we are trying to meet in the NGO community to guard the Grand Bargain and Global Compact on refugees, better financing and longer term and more sustainable development and humanitarian approaches to refugee inclusion, particularly given the increasingly protracted nature of displacement and conflict. But of course, there are gaps in our knowledge and understanding. Most recently, to illustrate this gap, we saw a gap when we tried to take a closer look at implementation of the Global Compact on refugees in different donor and host countries. But we have gaps still, and our reach is limited. And so because of these gaps, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for government, civil society, development, and humanitarian actors to determine the ways in which the GCR, among other policy mechanisms and frameworks, have made, if any, tangible differences in refugee policies and practices, and in the actual lived lives and experiences of communities in forced displacement context. We can speak to some gaps in between policy and practice, but we rely on research to elucidate these gaps and thus help bridge this accountability and awareness gap. While, for example, we were able to speak with some of our own contacts in different governments and humanitarian development agencies, we note one gap that we are repeatedly seeing in the humanitarian development space, that research oftentimes is not extended to collaborating with the communities we're trying to serve. While there's momentum across all of our fields, from the academic to the development field, to localize and actively decolonize our work, a huge gap and need remains making sure that our research is not only on these communities, as we often do as a migration force focusing NGO, but also in collaboration and with them. How do we truly decolonize our methodologies and approaches day to day? And that's a question I pose to all of us and that we are continually trying to think about. Too often our research treats these communities as recipients, beneficiaries, and passive entities, when they can often be equipped with the tools to collect data, conduct research, and co-design policy and programmatic interventions, as they are often close to the ground, and we've seen them do this during the pandemic. And even with the research that NGOs can conduct, it still remains unclear whether the GCR and other policy frameworks have actually led to, for example, increased and more predictable funding for host countries and refugees in these displacement contexts, and looking at short-term versus longer-term aid. And lastly, bringing me to my last point, a lot of our focus in aid reform advocacy is around better humanitarian aid. And we've seen, and there is still many gaps in this as humanitarian needs continues to outpace humanitarian aid, particularly in FCD contexts. We advocate for better quality, faster, more flexible multi-year funding to frontline actors. However, a prerequisite to better funding is greater financial transparency. But for that, we need better data and better research. So we continue to find critical gaps in data. On funding flows, this entails pass-through into frontline responders, particularly local actors, humanitarian versus development financing, and first and second level recipients. We are trying to collaborate more with researchers to conduct data analysis, advocate for a shared methodology and definition, for example, around multi-year funding, to work toward greater accountability for financing refugee responses, and to better understand the gaps in funding that exist. But again, as we need partners in the academic space, in the data space, and development space so that we can come together and make our advocacy more robust. And now I'll turn the microphone back to Domenico. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was really inspiring. And I think it's clear that there are some threads that are forming in our conversation. And, we are constantly reminded about, the importance of having data, for example, importance of having evidence that can be analyzed and used then for informing actions, whether they come from institutions such as the bank or UNHCR, but also NGOs, as we just heard Sarah. One element that I picked, and I would like now to go back to our panelists. Both Sarah and at the beginning, Mr. Ali, they mentioned methodologies and not just the data. So, Carolina, I would like to bring you back to the floor with the next question, which is, in which areas of research, what is the most, if you could point us toward which areas can research advancement, also including methodological ones, can have the deepest impact in relation to policy and programming? Where do you see the most promising avenues, if you want, for research opportunities? Thinking also potentially on what we heard so far. Over to you, Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we want to go beyond data, but I do have to sort of say a word about data, and then because I think so let's look at the glass half full. I mean, I think the last few years have really been witness to a really big push on data, on refugees, on displaced populations. And thanks to that, I think we've seen the emergence of a lot of new research, right, in this area. And hopefully that's really improving our understanding and the efficacy of what we can do in this space. But there's a lot that needs to be done still. And I think we need to maintain that momentum and those investments to continue to fill those data gaps. And as we do that, I think it's critical that whenever possible, we explore the possibility, and I'm so glad that our colleague from CAR is here, to explore the possibility of working with national statistical institutes, so that these efforts don't become a one-off, something that is driven by a particular academic institution or by a particular, international institution or NGO, but rather become part and parcel of the way that countries think about the evidence that they need for policy making. And again, I think we are succeeding. We have some good experiences in this space, but there's a lot more that could be done. So I just wanted to say that, because without that, we could sort of, hypothesize about a lot of interesting topics that we want to look into, but we won't be able to do that. And then sort of more concretely to your question, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a team of people that sort of really focus on poverty and equity issues. So I don't know if these are sort of the most relevant topics for everybody, but they are certainly very relevant for us. And some of them, I think, intersect with some of the issues that Xavier and Sarah brought up. So just maybe to mention three of them. The first one is that I really think that there's still work that we all need to do around the idea of what welfare and well-being mean when we talk about refugees and displaced populations. And we typically, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about inequality, we typically use sort of monetary metrics, right? How much somebody consumes, how much is their income. And we tend to do that also when we talk about refugees and displaced populations. But there are many reasons why these may not be the best metrics when we look at these groups, and maybe we need to rethink a little bit or think about complementary ways in which we can measure their worth. For example, we know that, for many refugees in camps, they are the beneficiaries of sort of food distribution or, the provision of services like health and education in camps. And if you follow traditional methodologies, this will make them look sort of relatively well off, right? Because some of their basic needs are met through those programs. But at the same time, we know that they may be facing very severe constraints in terms of their ability to access employment, their ability to move, right? Their ability to sort of exercise a certain number of rights that, you know, maybe all of us take for granted. So again, you know, would we say, oh, they're not poor, right? Or would we take into account this sort of more holistic view of what it means, what welfare means? So I think that's one area where, you know, maybe a little bit more thinking as we get better data and have a better understanding of the ecosystem in which these populations live will be important. And similarly, I think bringing some elements of not just what the data tell us, but what these individuals feel. And I think Sarah was making a little bit of this point, right? Because we do talk about welfare as being something objective, but also something subjective. And again, this is an area where I think there's more that could be done. So that's kind of the first bucket in my view. The second bucket, which I think we have all alluded to directly or indirectly, is to continue to move the needle on better understanding what works and what doesn't when we, you know, work with refugee and displaced populations. And this ranges from the immediate, you know, the effectiveness of aid, you know, the impact of humanitarian assistance, how can that assistance be delivered more effectively? But also when we think about sort of longer term issues that we tend to think more in terms of development, like, you know, economic and social integration. We have an enormous amount of heterogeneity in the way that different countries have approached these issues in terms of the policies and the programs that they've put in place, the regulation that surrounds refugee and displaced populations. And I think there's plenty that we can still do to understand, you know, how those are working or not and how they can be improved. And then my last bucket, which is something that Xavi also alluded to, is to continue to improve our understanding of the nexus between conflict, displacement, and climate, which unfortunately I suspect are going to become more and more intertwined in the years ahead. And then of all those things combined, you know, their relationship and their impact on poverty. And this is something that, you know, we've been sort of raising the alarm on now for quite some time at the World Bank, that we see an increasing sort of intersection between, you know, fragility and conflict, climate risks, and sort of climate impacts, and the incidence of extreme poverty. So that's another area where I think, you know, investing in knowledge will really make us a lot more effective in tackling those challenges individually and as a sort of whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Ninette, next I would like to come back to you. And I would like to go back to my introduction when I mentioned the fact your work on the flagship publication, People Forced to Flee: History, Change, and Challenge. I know that you know, to get there, to reach the end of this book, you have worked together with researchers and practitioners. You have received many contributions. So reflecting also on that experience, what do you think? What does it take for researchers to progress in order to inform policies? How can we motivate, you know, researchers to produce more and more research that is operationally relevant to some extent? Over to you, Ninette.
Well, thank you for that most pertinent question. And I start by saying that writing the book gave me a much better sense of how much research is out there, research that I wasn't aware of. I can't tell you how many times they said, oh man, if I only knew then what I'm reading now, it would have been helpful. And I think the research landscape, Domenico, as you know and you've written about, has expanded almost exponentially in the last decade to really wonderful effect. We see it also in the monthly digests that we get from the JDC. We see it in comparative studies that do a literature review, such as Vermeer and Schutler did in 2019 on the economic impact of forced displacement. It was mind-boggling, the number of real quality research studies that are very context-specific that are out there. But I also would make four observations as to where I think there are still areas that we could improve in terms of the link between research and implementation. And I say this appreciating that, as Carolina has mentioned, so much work is being done in the bank to do just that. So my observations are not necessarily applicable to all, but one of the things that I did notice is that research that academics undertake is often driven by what is interesting from an academic perspective, what adds to the existing literature, but it may not be issues that are clearly of policy priorities to governments or to operational agencies, or when they may be relevant to policy, government policy, or operational implementation. They might not be expressed in a manner, the results might not be expressed in a manner that it's readily to discern that from the research undertaken. I say that recognizing that so many of the papers that we are being highlighted at this conference aren't that. They do speak to the policy and implementation relevance, but I still wonder whether or not what is being chosen for study reflects the priorities of governments in the context that are being studied, and also of operations in terms of their operational performance and their ability to have greater impact in what they do. I think there's still a gap there that needs to be bridged. And in addition to the work that the World Bank is doing on that, I wonder, is there space for others? Is there space, for example, for the JDC? And I appreciate, Domenico, you're trying to do that in this session, but could we have more of it where we try to bring the priority setting more to the fore to inform researchers, but also it requires other agencies and governments a willingness to also undertake research in areas that might imply a change in the approach that they're taking, which is not always apparent, or you don't always see that open posture either on the point of governments or the point of agencies. But I still think there's more that could be done in that regard. And I think that speaks to engagement, and it's something that Sarah mentioned, is how are research topics chosen for study. I was struck in writing the book when I looked at a number of the studies on the socioeconomic impact of forced displacement and household surveys and things like that, the benefit of methodologies that engaged a multi-stakeholder approach from the beginning, that engaged governments, that engaged institutions, persons of concern, local authorities, in both the research question being posed, the methodology undertaking, the execution of that methodology, the dissemination and discussion of results, and that there's potential, I think, for more impact when you have that wider engagement from the outset. I think another issue is the whole issue around, even if you have all that in place, again, just to harken back that governments may not be willing to move on the findings discovered. I mentioned statelessness. If we could look at the socioeconomic costs of statelessness, I'm not saying that's a priority in Lebanon today. It was of interest at the time. But would that have changed the political discussion? I'm not sure. But the political economy issues could have been factored in the research at the beginning, which I think would be helpful. The other issue is whether or not there's so much being done in institutional levels, the UNHCR, WFP, UNICEF, IRC, to engage with researchers, to pick important topics, but how much are we then implementing the results that we're engaged in that work on? And is there the right mix between headquarters engagement with researchers and capacity in the field and motivation in the field and ability in the field to implement the changes that the research throws up could be necessary or beneficial to operations? I think that's an ongoing question. I also think an ongoing question is the role that donors have to play. Donors are increasingly including a requirement for impact evaluations in their granting of funds, and it would be interesting to see to what extent that is improving implementation or not. So, and how can we make socioeconomic, political research really integral to operation planning at the field level? These are open questions. I don't really have an answer to them. But I'd close with another area, which is knowledge resources. One of the things I was struck with in the book is how much research is out there, but I was able to access it through access to academic journals and a lot of digging. How can we make operationally or policy relevant research more readily available in a way that implementers, government actors, and operational agencies can understand that it's not so that the results of that research that's often written up in a very technical manner can be more readily accessed and acted upon at the field level. I think that's another, just how we improve our knowledge exchange. Over.
Thank you very much, Ninette. All extremely valid points. And actually, I would like to, since you mentioned, of course, the role of resources, the role of donors, there is a question in the chat that highlights that there is very little academic research funding available in relation to internal displacement, to some extent almost contrasting this with respect to what happens on studies on refugees. So that's an interesting element that we may want to reflect upon in those future events that we will organize, Ninette, to bring again academic and practitioners together. Thank you, Ninette. In her previous intervention, Carolina mentioned the importance of working with national statistical offices and how the collaboration across the institution can be critical to make sure that the outcomes of these collaborations are not one-off, but actually are very well structured. So I would like now to go back to the Director General of the National Institute of Statistics of the Central African Republic, because we know that the production of policy relevant research can be constrained by capacity constraints. And so I would like to ask you, what type of cross-institutional arrangements can help an institution like the one you lead in dealing with the production of forced displacement data, and make sure that, again, this production is informed by the latest research and evidence. Mr. Lee, if you can come in, the floor is yours again.
Oui, merci. Nous avons suivi tout au long de ce débat très intéressant les interventions des uns et des autres. Et concernant ma question, je voudrais dire effectivement la collaboration entre les structures gouvernementales et les institutions comme la Banque mondiale, l'UNHCR et certains instituts de recherche pourraient contribuer à renforcer davantage les capacités en matière de recherche dans les pays. Je prends l'exemple de la République centrafricaine où tout à l'heure je disais qu'il y a un peu plus de 700 000 déplacés internes dans le pays. C'est quand même intéressant d'avoir des connaissances et à cet effet, cette collaboration avec les structures, comme je viens de mentionner, pourrait permettre de développer davantage la recherche. C'est ce que nous avions fait récemment avec la Banque mondiale dans le cadre de l'enquête sur les conditions de vie des ménages ou avec l'appui du programme, je crois c'est JDC, nous avions introduit dans cette enquête sur les conditions de vie des ménages un volet concernant les personnes déplacées internes, chose que nous n'avons pas l'habitude de le faire. Et en faisant cette recherche, nos capacités aussi se sont améliorées en matière de méthodologie, de collecte des données auprès de ces structures. Je rappelle que en ce qui concerne l'Institut, nous avions réalisé une enquête sur les personnes déplacées en 2007 et ce n'est qu'en 2021 que nous avons réalisé la seconde étude où véritablement nous avions parlé des personnes déplacées internes. Donc, il se pose aussi un problème de financement, un problème d'implication des instituts nationaux de statistiques et pourquoi pas des instituts universitaires pour vraiment améliorer les capacités en matière de recherche sur le déplacement forcé. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. We hope we'll be able to hear again from you also as well in future events. We're moving toward the end of this panel. I would like to signal that, again, there are very interesting questions in the chat. There is one directly for you, Ninette, in case you want to reply in the chat, or we can also take it later in, offline. You will be able to reply in writing to our guests. There are very important remarks in the chat in terms of what. Thank you, sir. Thanks. In case of what happens when.
Merci.
Merci à vous encore, monsieur. What happens when there are policy failures that might be maybe due to research not being effective in terms of policy not following some research indications, as in the case highlighted in the question. These are maybe elements that we can reflect upon during these days, and maybe we can come back to them in our final reflection on the last day. We've heard from our panelists the point of views at the global and the local level, and therefore I'm very happy that we are able to close this panel with our last guest, who is Sajad Malik. Sajad, who I see now on screen. Hello, Sajad. Welcome. Is the director of the Division of Resilience and Solution at UNHCR. Sajad has a long career in UNHCR. He has worked for many years in the field. He's been in a number of different countries, spanning from Pakistan to Ethiopia. I won't name them all because it would take me too long. He's been the UNHCR representative in Syria. So he's been very, very close to the field and to operations. But right now, as I said, he's the director of this division, which is a division in which the role of research and the socioeconomic analysis is becoming more and more important. So Sajad, I would like to invite you to close our session, giving us your reflection on what you've heard, but also on how research is informing the work of DRS. And what would you like to hear more from how would you motivate researchers to work more with you and with UNHCR? Over to you, Sajad.
Thank you, Domenico. Thank you, JDC, for organizing this extremely good and rich event. I've been listening to the debate, even the earlier session. And in this particular one, to hear Carolina and then my colleague Ninette, who was in my neighborhood when I was in Syria, maybe a little bit later than Syria and Lebanon, looking at the whole situation of the Syria crisis, and having Xavier on this call again, who worked so hard in setting up the Joint Data Center. I think it's extremely rich panel. Then to hear Sarah and then Mr. Ali from Central African Republic, where the work is going on. I would just quickly highlight a few points. I think it's been extremely rich discussion. I would not even like to make an effort to attempt or make an attempt to even bring these things together, because I think the recording will itself show how rich the inputs have been by this panel on that one. But just to highlight that by mid-2021, we had 84 million people displaced. And this number had gone up from 82.4 million by the end of 2020. So within 6 months, the number has gone up. So there are lots of old and new questions around this displacement. There are frontier issues that are emerging. And in the refugee situation, nearly 70% of the refugees are living in protracted situations, which is an average 23 years. So the displacement, once it takes place, it becomes really very protracted. Ninette has highlighted from operational perspective that we often, I've been out in the field in situations as manager that I wish I had more research, I wish I had more data, I wish I had more analysis available. It's not that it was not available sometimes, it was available, but I think the operational relevance to bring that information, that knowledge to the fore has become quite a big challenge. And we think we've picked it up with the Joint Data Center. Carolina highlighted the knowledge producers, the knowledge consumers, the contributors. But I think the important one, which we are missing quite a bit and can come out quite strongly, is the translators. There's a lot of data out there, a lot of research out there. How do we translate that into practical advice for senior managers, for policymakers, government, and the others? But let me just quickly come back to how UNHCR is transforming. I think with the introduction of the Joint Data Center, the work with the World Bank, a real game changer in forced displacement in that sense. Research is now becoming very much the central piece of discussions. Just a few examples, and you've heard some colleagues advise me to highlight this because these are important that we look at this. For example, in Kenya, the comparable poverty data with the World Bank that we've done has helped translate some of the discussions in Kenya. We are moving in the direction where camps are being looked at, not at camps anymore, but looking at transforming some of these camps into villages that can be integrated into the national systems. In Brazil, there was a study done on which had become basically a foundation for dialogue with the government in Brazil. This is again with the World Bank, UNHCR together, to relocation and inclusion of refugees into national strategies. In Uganda, the research has helped move away from some of the reductions that were coming into place and including all of this into national discussions around that. Let me just also say that, and you've highlighted this in the discussion, that this tremendous amount of work that has happened over the years now, but there's still inherent challenge between the academic research and the work that policy makers and practitioners would require that. And it's true. We see this already, as Ninette has highlighted, that there is an incentive, for research, new research ideas that come out. But we also need to align these with the challenges of the operational relevance of this information. That still remains quite a bit of a challenge. How do we translate that gradually as we go on? And my colleagues at the Joint Data Center hear us all the time from our UNHCR managers, the operational relevance of the discussion. Even the World Bank colleagues in the field look at it and say, we need to have some work that can have discussions at the policy level, at the national institutes that, for example, the statistic departments are looking at it to have more operational engagement around that. There are also other challenges that are there. I think on the methodological side, there's more discussions is helping us refine that discussion a little bit. And I think we need to continue moving in that direction to make sure that the approaches that we are introducing are very much in line with what are the requirements in most of these operations are. I think some very good pieces are emerging, which are changing the policy debate in many of these refugee hosting countries, which is a good sign to have. Now, in terms of areas where we feel that there is some gap still there, Ninette highlighted statelessness. I think this is an area where in a number of countries, Lebanon is one, which is highlighted, but there are many of other situations where work around statelessness would help a greatly. What we also see is a gap on the linkage of mental health and employment related areas. Again, we have seen that the research around other areas are taking place, but this would be something that is a gap that we see. Longitudinal studies, research, I think that is also, we feel that it's important that we remain more and more engaged on that. That is helping in a number of areas. 4 longitudinal panels, one in Bangladesh, in Colombia, we have Kenya and Jordan. This is showing a different trend. So it's more of 3 to 5 years work that is going on. So we see over a period of time how these studies are helping us understand the challenges better and then engage governments in policy and also transform some of our programs around that. Carolina highlighted the high frequency phone surveys. We benefited a great deal from that, Carolina. World Bank, huge support by including refugees on these high frequency surveys. The data that is emerging, which is now being used, thanks also to the Joint Data Center, helping us translate that data, which we are sharing with our managers in different operations, and then engaging with our national interlocutors, but also our donors in that sense to say to bring some comparative analysis. Yes, these are people who are not citizens, their needs are different. If they're statistically invisible, they can also be not included in national programs. So how do we bring them to the fore by engaging them in and including them in national statistics, and then arguing a case not only that they're vulnerable, but they also have legal vulnerability, that they're not the citizens. So I think we've done quite a bit around those areas. I would just borrow some words from Carolina's intervention, but I think we see also glass as half full. I think we have done quite a lot of work, but there's also a lot of research available out there that need to be translated into work that can translate this research, this analysis into material for policymakers to then have that discussion around that. So available research, but also new research. We would like to look at some of the frontier issues, which often are not looked into or are not researched enough. Maybe that can be something that we can bring to the fore. But the data that is available, how do we become better translators into that? There's been a substantial amount of work that has gone into that, so there's momentum. I think what I've seen in UNHCR amongst my colleagues, I've spent with like Ninette a number of years in the organization, but I think the transformation that is taking place now on data and research and utility of it, I've not seen that in the past. I think since over the last few years with the support of the World Bank, it is becoming a debate that, yes, we can go and do advocacy and we can talk about it, we can argue their case, but if we do have data and evidence with us, we can have more substantive discussion and get more impact on that. And that is beginning to instill in the organization. The other thing that I would highlight here is that we are also changing the face of our workforce. We are reskilling, reprofiling, which is based on this the data that is coming and the evidence that is emerging. We are now have not as many as we would like it to be, but we have economists in our teams now, which are not at the center in my division, but also more importantly out in the field, who are looking at this, helping us understand this, making our case from forced displacement point of view. But there also a new category of staff that we have introduced, which we now call development officers. They are outposted in the field to draw lessons from these work that is going on and support our senior managers in that sense. This is just to show that all of this is helping us transform internally also in UNHCR, and the support that we're getting from the Joint Data Center, apart from this research conference, which is a huge benefit for us to see how we take this work forward, but also transforming UNHCR internally on that. We have done a lot. I think we need to maintain the momentum. We need to continue pushing in that direction. And as much as this research from the academic point of view is required and necessary, I think equally important is that we translate that for the policymakers, and that work will continue to happen. Thanks again, Domenico. Wonderful. And I just got absorbed in the panel's intervention that I completely forgot about the messages that I had to convey. But I think it was very rich discussion. And thank you again. And back to you, Domenico.
Thank you very much, Sajjad. If you got lost, we didn't notice. It was very clear. I am aware of the time, so I think I'm going to bring this to an end. I just would like to say that, when we thought about this panel, the idea was really to try not only to connect researchers and practitioners, but also to provide a platform for researchers to observe what kind of elements can be useful for them to better integrate their work within policy and programming. I believe we've offered several of these elements. We could have gone ahead for a long time discussing more of these elements, and so I would be tempted to conclude this session by saying to be continued, following also the indication of Ninette. I would really like to thank all of you, of course, our panelists, our speakers, our audience. I know it's late, but you are still here, and this is great. I conclude for the panel here, thanking you all and inviting you to come back to the conference tomorrow. We will start again 8 a.m. East or 2 p.m. in Central European time. Thank you all and see you tomorrow. Bye.